thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks to Caroline and Patrick for giving the presentation today. So Caroline Maths here, Dr. Caroline Maths, is a research fellow at the Centre of Rock Art Research and Management at UWA. Caroline is a geoscientist and completed her PhD at UWA in 2020. She's now working with a multidisciplinary team alongside archaeologists and Aboriginal custodians. They're using innovative scientific approaches to produce records of past climate and landscapes that influence human occupation in the northwest of Australia over the last 50,000 years. And Patrick Morrison is an archaeologist and a current PhD student at the Centre of Rock Art Research and Management, UWA. His current work investigates how people in the Murujuga responded to climate change in the deep past, with a focus on maritime culture. During his honours at UWA, he was part of the team that discovered the first submerged Aboriginal archaeological site in Australia. His other work at the WA Museum is on rapid 3D recording of underwater shipwreck sites. Australia's oldest shipwreck. So yeah, thanks a lot. And today's presentation is called Dating Murujuga's Dreaming, Reconstructing Climate and Landscapes Through Time to Understand Human Occupation and Rock Art Production. So I'll now hand over to Caroline and Patrick, and they can get on with their presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us online today. Firstly, hopefully this is going to work. Yep. Try and make the slides go. Yep. Okay. Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge the 𝑺𝒄𝒉𝒐𝒍 people, the traditional custodians of the land from which we're talking to you today here in Perth, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We'd also like to acknowledge the 𝑛𝒉𝒂𝒕, the traditional custodians of Murujuga, the land where we conduct our research and about which we're talking today, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. So we're going to be talking about our research, which is actually part of a larger multidisciplinary project called Dating Murujuga's Dreaming. And this is a collaborative ARC linkage project between the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, UWA, Uni Melbourne, Uni Wollongong, and with Rio Tinto and Woodside. So you may have heard of Murujuga and the Burrup Peninsula. It's well known for its rock art and heritage values. It's the world's largest rock art province and is National Heritage listed, and we hope soon to be World Heritage listed. So our project aims to use scientific analysis of landscapes and rock art to date and contextualise the art province. And today, Patrick and I are going to be talking about our research, which more specifically aims to refine knowledge of the climate, environment and landscape over the whole period of human occupation. And with that, to understand how that would have influenced people living and creating rock art in this region. So I'll pass over to Patrick to tell you more about the history of Murujuga.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'd also like to acknowledge we're speaking from Noongar land and acknowledge the 𝒉𝒂𝒕. I'm an archaeologist, so we study human history and we're really looking for that human story since people came to Australia. Murujuga is Nura, or country in the northwest of Australia, so it's in the Pilbara region, and it's currently comprised of the Burrup and 42 different islands. It's hugely significant, as Caroline said, because there's about 50,000 years of occupation there, and people lived there throughout the depths of the Ice Age, and the last glacier maximum 22,000 years ago. And then it's also significant because during this entire time, people were producing rock art, and that's left us with well over 1 million pieces of rock art in this place, which is more art than anywhere else on the planet. It's a hugely significant rock art site. It's currently co-managed by 5 different Aboriginal groups. There's the Ngarluma, the Mardudhunera, the Yabara, the 𝑦𝒈𝒑𝒑𝒠𝒑 and the Wangatu. And yeah, they manage it now partly as a national park, it's partly nature reserve, but it's also an industrial landscape. So there's the Pluto project, and the Karratha gas plant there. So it's got this huge history that is still developing. It's quite like an interesting space to work. So this is like the northwest of Australia. You can see Indonesia to the north. People came down here, passed through Arnhem Land about 65,000 years ago and ended up in Murujuga, which is in this box, probably around 50,000 years ago, maybe earlier. So if we zoom in, you can see Barrow Island there to the left. That's where we've got 50,000 years of certain occupation. And then Murujuga to the right, you can see the peninsula, which in Murujuga in the local language means hip bone sticking out. You can see it like really sticking out. And then there's all the islands. The one to the north is like Rosemary, and then you've got Enderby and the West and East Lewis Islands. Now this brings us back in time to where we're interested in. So 65,000 years, people first arrive in Australia. And the sea level is like 100 meters or 80 meters lower than it is today. The land was very, very different, but as you went into the height of the Ice Age, it reduced even further, and it was about 130 meters lower than it is today, revealing about 20% more of the Australian continent than we currently have. At this time, Murujuga was an arid range, about 160 kilometers inland, but then the sea level rose. And you can see there is a very rapid event. It happened over just 10,000 years, from about 22 to 10,000 years, and would have massively changed the way that people interacted with landscape. Obviously, they're not living on the places that are underwater. Those people would have been forced off in mass migrations, and a lot of them ended up in Murujuga. So we get to the Holocene, which is the last 10,000 years. And that is a period of relative climate stability in contrast to what had happened before with this enormous shift out of an ice age. That being said, there's still a lot of variability in the climate during that time. And so we're interested in exactly how people responded to that climate change. And one of the most interesting ways they responded in Murujuga was to the sea level rise itself. So we have this really interesting and strong record of a change in the focus of the rock art. The oldest art is what we call this colonization repertoire. It's very similar to what is all across the northwest or the north of Australia, and even some up into Papua New Guinea. This is probably what people were bringing with them when they first got here. But what we also notice is that there's a huge terrestrial focus in the subjects of the art. There's a lot of kangaroos, there's a lot of emus, there's a lot of lizards. As it gets younger and the art looks a lot fresher, it transitions to this maritime focus. So you have a lot more whales and dugong and fish. It's very clear that people are moving from this place that was 130 kilometers inland, really far away, to becoming this coastal archipelago it is today. The other thing that happened is that all of these people obviously migrated off the continental shelf and were changing the way they lived. So we think broadly that they went from being very broad-based and living across really quite big ranges to becoming more sedentary. And some of the evidence for that is on one of the outer islands, Rosemary, where you've got some of the earliest house structures in Australia, dated to about 8,000 years ago, which is when the sea level would have kind of got to there, and it would have been the shoreline rather than an island. Later on in the mid-Holocene, things are still changing. So we see this huge transition in the way that they're focusing their economy from a very mangrove shellfish heavy economy all the way to kind of like sand flat and rocky species. And this is a change that's mirrored across the north of Australia. By the time European people got here and were observing how people were living in Murujuga, people were certainly rafting around the archipelago. So some of the outer islands, like Rosemary, are about 3 kilometers of ocean crossing to get there. You probably need a raft. It's quite a long swim, especially if you're going to be doing it regularly. That wouldn't be very fun. So when Philip Parker King visited in 1818, he observed people accessing the inner islands, and he also saw fires on the outer islands, and observed people on what were called like 𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 like bicycle-style small rafts that people could cross the ocean on. They're made out of just mangrove logs. This is interesting because this contrasts with Dampier, William Dampier's visit in 1699, where he didn't see anyone out on the islands. And we wonder if this is due to some seasonal factors. And this is why we're so interested in the climate, is that during the summer, which is when Philip Parker King observed them moving between the islands, there's a lot of water available because of the monsoon, and there's also turtles hatching. There's resources on these islands. Whereas when Dampier visited, it was in winter. There's probably not a lot to go out there. So we don't really know exactly how people are using these islands, but we're already getting a sense that, look, it could be seasonal. They're clearly accessing them with watercraft. At some point, those watercraft would have had to be introduced or invented or something. And what we really don't have a good sense of is, when did these things start? How long have they been going on? Has it been like this since the islands were first created, or is it a more recent invention? The pattern across most of Australian islands is something that's been a question for a very long time. And archaeologists are always interested in this sort of stuff, but a general pattern that we observe, with a lot of exceptions, is that there is this intensification before it separates. So the sea level gets there, you have this mass migration off the shelf, and then people are using these islands, or what are now the islands, when they are just the shoreline. But then as soon as they're separated, people seem to abandon them. And in some places, maybe the population takes like 1,000 years to abandon them or even goes extinct, but it certainly drops off until the late Holocene, the last 1,000 or 2,000 years, where people seem to return to those islands. And we link that to the reintroduction of watercraft. And that's obviously a very technological way of looking at it. And so this is one thing we go, well, does this model fit for Murujuga? And that's something we'd really like to sink our teeth into. And the reason we're interested in this broadly is because we can think it can tell us a lot about how people respond to climate and culture. Obviously, the way people culturally respond to climate change is a huge issue at the moment. And it's something we're going to have to kind of think through more in the future. But this has been going on for a very long time in different ways. And we link things like the changes to ENSO, so La Nina and El Nino, to abandonment of some islands in the Great Barrier Reef or in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and also some of the ways that people lived on islands in the Bass Strait for kind of 1,000 years after they were separated, and then eventually maybe went extinct or abandoned them. And there's evidence for huge trading networks in places like the Coral Sea. So people are using islands all around Australia. But this is obviously modulated by exactly when they separated. What are the water conditions? What are the availability of resources on those islands? These are all climate sensitive things. And islands of any sort of landform, of any sort of place that someone is going to live, is probably one of the most sensitive to this ongoing climate change. So we think we can use it as a really good test bed of how does seasonality affect people. The problem we run into with this sort of research is that the details of past climate is poorly constrained. We have a very good idea now that there was an ice age and there was the height of it at 22,000 years ago, and it got warmer after that. But the specific details of that, especially when you want to zoom into that regional, human level of how are people actually living and what are the weathers and seasonalities that people are actually responding to, we don't have very well resolved. And those are things that have to be resolved for the particular place you're trying to study. One example of this, if I can get it to play, is the specifics of sea level rise. So you can see in the middle here, we've got the beautiful satellite-derived bathymetry for Murujuga. You can see all those sand bodies, you can see all those old shorelines right at the edge, and you can see the current islands. If you take the current sea level curve and just run it over that, you can see, well, this is what the separation of the islands looks like. There's all sorts of interesting things that happen. You've got 100 years where things like West Lewis Island and Enderby are connected. The problem is a lot of those assumptions are driven by just the placement of sand bodies, or assuming that the islands, the sediments that made up the islands were there when this process was happening, which we know is obviously not true. A lot of those sediments and those sands would have moved in pretty huge ways because of that sea level rise, and we just want to get a handle on it. But we don't know that yet. The other sort of thing, which Caroline will go more into, is just the water availability on the islands. And so a kind of product you'd be looking for is the FIDA product, which is a data assimilation product. They've taken climate models and moved in data to try to get a sense of when is there going to be drought. You've got a drought index plotted here. The red bits are 1,000 years, 1,300 years are times when we think there might have been intense droughts. That would mean people probably couldn't visit the island at that time, if we're right. But the problem is those models are built with not a lot of regional data. This one, for example, the only regional data point that spans the whole 2,000 years is a speleothem in Indonesia, which, as complex as the monsoon is, it's probably capturing some part of it, but it is not capturing exactly what's happening in Murujuga at that time. It's not capturing how much water is there available in the pools. So I'm looking at a few different proxies to solve this. I'm going to quickly talk about one, which is the dune at the north of Dampier Island. So there's a huge dune system that is like we think has developed in the late Holocene. You can see our little map here. Before we went on any fieldwork, we were looking at it and went, well, probably what has happened here. And so the sea level was higher by about a metre or two, a few metres, at about 3,000 years ago. And we think that the dune started forming then, and then as it, like the sea level dropped, the dune prograded a few hundred metres to its present position. If that's true, then that captures like the oceanographic conditions and the sediment availability over the last few thousand years. So we can start disentangling where exactly were those sand bodies before and how much sand has moved in. How much do we have to think about how, like, which islands could you wade to and which islands couldn't you wade to? So we've been coring them. The way we're looking at that is we're just like drilling down into them and we're trying to find the beach surface that sits underneath. It's very clearly marked by shells. And we're radiocarbon and we're going to try some OSL dating on the sand to get a sense of exactly when did this current dune like start to overlay the modern or the old surface. And we hope that gets us to things like deep water swell and maybe cyclone frequency, or if there's a prevailing northerly wind, which you tend to need to like create a north-facing dune. But you can see from this like chart of the yearly wind in Murujuga that you only really get a few afternoons of northerly wind, and then kind of at the end of January you have a big red cyclone that comes through. So we think we're going to start looking at different beach directions to see if there's differences in these dunes. But we're hoping that like just looking at this will give us some first regional records of exactly how is this landscape forming. And here's some initial data we got from our fieldwork a few months ago, and it's exactly as we expected. So you can see this dune goes all the way back to about 4,000 years, and it seems to be accumulating at the exact same rate, pretty much. It's a straight line since then. So we're probably capturing quite a stable period of climate over the last 4,000 years, but it will be interesting to see if this is reflected in the other dunes that are facing towards other directions, towards other swells or other winds. With that being said, I think that's everything that I need to say. So I'll hand back over to Caroline.
Okay, so to take this back a step, how can we understand environmental changes in deep time at Murujuga, and also exactly what is proxy data and how can we use it? So proxy data tells us about conditions which occurred in the past, which may relate to a specific environmental condition or process, such as rainfall. And then we can use this proxy data as an indirect measurement to build a record of that condition over time. So for example, this is how we might reconstruct rainfall from tree ring analysis. So some examples of archives of proxy data, as I mentioned, tree rings. Another one is speleothems, which are carbonate deposits that have formed in caves from drip water, and also sediment cores. And the idea is that these types of archives are deposited or grow incrementally and can be analysed at intervals to provide a time series of environmental data. So a few things we need to consider when looking for proxy archives is the type of data that they'll provide, whether it's information about the climate or some other environmental indicator, such as changes in vegetation. The time scale of the archive is very important, and for us, we want archives that formed within the last 65,000 years to encompass some part of that period of human occupation. And we also need to consider the length of the record. Is it only spanning tens of years or maybe thousands of years? And then the resolution of that data, whether it is going to tell us maybe about seasonal patterns or much longer term broader shifts in the climate over thousands or tens of thousands of years. And ideally, we can analyse multiple proxy archives to build the most complete record of the past that provides data on a variety of timescales. Sorry, just clicking backwards and forwards here. So having a look at some of the available proxy records that have already been compiled, Patrick touched on this earlier. This map shows open access records for the Australasian region that inform on hydroclimate within the past few thousand years. And you can see there's quite a range of records However, when we zoom in on WA, you can see there's little data for WA and the northwest coast. There are a few coral records and a tree ring record for the Pilbara, but they actually only span over the last few hundred years since European arrival. So this length of time is not too useful for us in terms of understanding larger changes in the climate and environment over the whole period of human occupation. When we add in some additional data from the literature, there are some speleothem records, particularly one from Cape Range for 26,000 years. So that may be of interest for us as it encompasses the last glacial maximum. A few variety of marine core proxy records on varying timescales, but overall there's no local data for Murujuga, and there's very limited data for the timescales we're interested in. So this is really the gap that we're looking to fill. So our team has been surveying the landscape at Murujuga and investigating potential proxy archives. So on the top right there, we're actually conducting an electrical resistivity survey, which can tell us about the depth and types of sediments in the subsurface. And that's the sort of information we can use to understand whether it might be worth taking a sediment core, for example. And we've also been looking at the characteristics of soils. So on the bottom left there, that's Matthias doing some soil sampling to understand more about the soils across the landscape and get further environmental data. But the proxy archive I want to talk more about today, and is the focus of my research, is freshwater carbonate, also known as Tufa. So these deposits are widespread at Murujuga, occurring in many of the creeks and pools, often at waterfalls, and it's composed of calcium carbonate. And the reason I'm focusing on these deposits is that carbonates are well known to be a great geoarchive. And the reason for that is that the analysis of carbonate can inform on a range of environmental and climatic conditions at the time of precipitation. So in particular, the chemistry of carbonate minerals can tell us quite specific information about the source water from which it formed, which in turn relates to the hydrological processes and hydroclimate. Importantly, carbonate can also be dated, and dating of proxy archive material is obviously very important for us to put this information into context. And as well as providing environmental proxy data, the Tufa are also relevant in terms of human occupation. The distribution of many waterholes and creeks is associated with a high density of rock art. And this makes sense, as people would have wanted to spend time close to freshwater resources. So the Tufa themselves, forming from fresh water, are actually providing a record of freshwater availability over time, where we can date them. And that can provide windows of opportunity for habitation and resource extraction. The Tufa are also expected to have formed over thousands or possibly even tens of thousands of years. So the timescale of that record is very relevant for us in the context of human occupation in the northwest. So we've been collecting some of these Tufa samples by drilling cores at a number of sites of large deposits. So far we've drilled several cores at 5 main sites, 3 on Burrup Peninsula and 2 to the west on Enderby Island. And when we do this, I'm collecting a lot of additional site information, as well as reference samples of soil and bedrock and water. And this is to understand more about the specific hydrological setting and landscape at each location. Undertaking this work can be very interesting and exciting. Here we have Matthias abseiling down a Tufa waterfall to drill a core from the centre of it. I should note that when we do this work, we also make sure to cover up any evidence of our activities and fill in the drill hole afterwards. So on the bottom right there, there's an example of the core that he has drilled in this picture. And you might be able to tell that there's some layers there. So that's ideal for us trying to build time series data in that the carbonate has precipitated incrementally. And the first thing we do once these cores are back at uni is to split them, and those images there is of some split cores, and you can see they're quite interesting to look at. So I can then characterise the cores and subsample for a range of analysis. So this includes thin sections for microscope work, as well as samples for dating and geochemical analysis. And to give you an idea of some of the main characteristics we're analysing, I look at the textural characteristics to identify formation processes, as well as indicators from plant material, animal remains, or even microbes. We look at the mineralogy and chemistry, which tells us about the formation processes, and as I mentioned, indicators of the chemistry of source water. In particular, stable isotope analysis of oxygen and carbon provides information, climatic proxy data, and other environmental information, such as about changes in vegetation. And another technique I'll employ is clumped isotope paleothermometry. So this technique can actually determine the temperature of the water from which the carbonate precipitated. So that's providing important climatic information, but also enhances our ability to interpret the other stable isotope data. I'll also be looking at pollen and other plant remains to understand vegetation changes through time. And lastly, dating the carbonate is imperative for building these records. So we're looking at a range of techniques to best constrain carbonate formation. We've actually had some initial luck with some radiocarbon dating. So the initial data is from samples taken from the middle and the base of the Tufa cores. And we found that they were all well within the range of radiocarbon dating. The range of that technique is about 45,000 years. So this seems to be a very appropriate technique for us moving forward. But there are some challenges. The main one being is that carbonates that precipitate can incorporate older dead carbon that's dissolved in the source water. So that's where an older carbonate rock may be weathered and adds additional carbon to the system, and then will result in an older apparent age of tufa formation. But on the flip side, we also have to consider whether there's any secondary precipitation and alteration. So due to these challenges, we're also looking to analyse trapped remnants of organic matter within the tufa, and that should provide more accurate dates that we can use to calibrate the radiocarbon ages of carbonate. So this is work we're currently undertaking with ANSTO, hopefully later this year. But based on our current initial radiocarbon ages, we can see that tufa has formed within the Holocene, and it actually appears to coincide with a shift to wetter conditions and the reintroduction of the monsoon around 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. And this makes sense that tufa is forming when we know that there's more water available in the landscape. So how does tufa actually form? The formation processes are important as they're influenced by the hydroclimate and local conditions. So it's important for us to understand the mechanisms of formation for interpreting the proxy data. So the tufa forms from calcium and carbon dioxide rich waters at surface temperatures. It's usually composed primarily of calcite, which is a calcium carbonate, and that's what we found to be the case at Murujuga. So the precipitation of calcite is promoted by degassing of carbon dioxide from water, and often by biological activity as well. So tufa is often distributed at waterfalls or where there's turbulence in the water flow, which creates greater degassing of carbon dioxide and triggers the precipitation. So we also see this where groundwater is emerging at springs and seeps and along rock walls. As you can see in the top image there's tufa along the rock wall as well as at the waterfall. So this is an important driver that we see in the distribution of tufa. But there's also evidence of plants and microbes that may have also influenced formation. So here's some examples. You can see this from the field scale down to the micro scale. On the top left there, that's a large waterfall deposit with Patrick for scale. And you'll notice there's large voids around the base and extending into the tufa, and that's actually where tree roots were growing in the tufa and have since degraded. Whereas the bottom left image shows where trees and shrubs are still growing within the tufa. And similarly, when we look at the sliced core sections, there's a variety of textures that relate to plants where the carbonate has precipitated around them. So, for example, the spongy texture highlighted there relates to precipitation around moss-like plants around the water. Microbial structures are also very obvious in the tufa, displaying where carbonate has formed within biofilms influenced by microbes and algae. So laminar stromatolitic textures are very common. Here on the left landscape image, you can see this large bulbous hanging zone at the base of the deposit. And when we slice this open, which is the central top image, you can see little bulbous, tufty laminar buildups, which is characteristic of microbial formation. But also on the bottom right there, you can see that there's snail shells incorporated into the tufa as well. And that's also quite common, just demonstrating what a biological rich environment they're forming in. So to further understand the conditions of carbonate precipitation, we've also been looking at the surface water chemistry at various pools and creeks. While the modern chemistry may not reflect past conditions when the tufa formed, it can tell us about how the water may relate to rainfall and groundwater and soil in the landscape. And we found that in the modern setting, the surface water is still oversaturated in respect to calcite and could still be forming tufa. And the locations with large tufa deposits actually displayed higher saturation of calcite, higher alkalinity, and high dissolved inorganic carbon. One location that's quite interesting to me, which is shown in the images to the right, shows evidence of very recent carbonate precipitation. So you can see an image on the bottom there of a leaf that's been precipitated on and probably being replaced by carbonate. So this site, which is indicated on the graph with a red arrow, had notably higher alkalinity. So this site may be an opportunity for us to study the active tufa formation in situ and analyse that data alongside the water chemistry to really understand the relationship between the water and the carbonate. Knowing this should improve our ability to interpret the proxy data of past conditions as well. Another question for us to address is the source of calcium and carbonate within these waters. So the carbon dioxide is delivered from the atmosphere and also increases in the soil zone from biological activity, resulting in higher CO2 within the subsurface waters. So then we have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in waters that are entering creek systems that will then degas once it's discharged. But what's more intriguing at Murujuga is the source of the calcium. So usually these large scale secondary carbonate deposits such as tufa forming in terrestrial environments, they're generally forming in areas of already carbonate terrain, so maybe underlain by a marine limestone, for example. So there you have weathering of these original limestone rocks that adds the source of carbonate and calcium to the water. However, at Murujuga, the bedrock is igneous. So here I've plotted the locations of major deposits, and we see immediately some trends with bedrock composition. So apologies, I couldn't add the legend to this, but the tufa along the eastern edge of Burrup Peninsula is within gabbro terrain, which is a mafic igneous rock. And the other tufa to the west on Enderby Island is in basaltic terrain or associated with dolerite dikes, so also a mafic igneous bedrock. So could these rocks be our source of calcium? And I think the answer is yes, as when we break down the chemistry of the rocks, there's notably higher calcium within the gabbro and basaltic composition rock types. So weathering of some of these mafic minerals, such as amphiboles and plagioclase, would deliver calcium to soils in solution. So we think the storage of calcium and carbon dioxide within the soil zone and delivery to creek systems is very important for tufa formation. So some of the further work I'll be doing is to assess in more detail the composition and weathering characteristics of the bedrock and soils to really identify that source of calcium. So we can use tools such as strontium isotope tracing to determine that source of calcium by comparing the chemistry in different reference materials. We'll also be undertaking a broader study of the soils to understand the overall hydrological functioning of the landscape. And this is going to be undertaken by our new PhD student, Diego, who just started yesterday in SAgE. So his work will include spatial analysis to delineate the catchments and understand more about surface flows and recharge. But he'll also be looking more closely at the soils throughout the landscape and using a variety of techniques to understand the capacity of the landscape to store and transport water. So this will obviously help us understand how waterholes, springs and seeps may have been sustained over time and also relate to the tufa formation. Additional environmental proxy data can also be derived from soil analysis and particularly understanding how characteristics of the soil may change at different depths and different landscape positions will tell us about the evolution of the landscape. So welcome, Diego. We're excited to see what his research will reveal during our project. So just to wrap up, our key outcomes are that we'll develop environmental and climatic proxy records to understand the conditions of Murujuga over time. We can also use this data to feed into climate models for this region. We'll improve our understanding of landscape evolution and islandization of Murujuga, and also determine the hydrological functioning of the landscape and understand how water is stored and transported. So this knowledge will provide a lot of context for us understanding human occupation and survival in the landscape, notably with information such as records of freshwater availability through time. And we'll also be able to assess the ability and practicality of humans voyaging and accessing the islands during the Holocene. So thanks very much, everyone. I'd like to quickly acknowledge our many team members and collaborators on this project, particularly Joe, Mick and Matthias, who we work with closely on this research, and to the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation and Circle of Elders for providing so much knowledge and allowing us to work with them in this amazing location. So happy to take some questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much to both of you. That was a really interesting talk, and I can see a few people giving it applause. Yes, thank you very much. To any of those of you who are online and listening, if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can pop them in the chat box, and myself or Michael can ask them on behalf of you. While you're thinking about it and thinking about your questions, I actually have one for the both of you. So I don't really have a background in all this, but I am quite interested in understanding modern day ecosystem responses to climate change and climate variability. And so I'm wondering if you have any sort of, or if you can use this information that you're looking back in this sort of long-term time series record, have we learned any lessons about how we can actually approach future climate change from what we've seen in the past? And so as you've seen that, you've showed some really nice figures of the changing sea level rise over time and how that has expanded and contracted the different islands around the region. Are there any lessons hidden in there about how we can plan for and adapt to climate change and variability, particularly with some of our Pacific Island nations and existing islands in the northwest region of WA? It's a bit of a challenging. It's a big picture challenging kind of question there. But are there any clues in our historical record?
Yeah, I guess we're, as you can tell, we're quite early in our research. So a lot of it was about what we're proposing to do. So I think from our stuff, we wouldn't necessarily have information yet that would inform a lot for future changes in that region. But obviously, overall, I think a big driver for a lot of people studying paleo climate and environment does also revolve around ongoing climate change and understanding how, there's been extinctions or major changes in vegetation, as well as major changes in human responses to climate change of the past. So I personally don't have any recommendations or advice on it. However, I think certainly it's like a really important area to consider, particularly as we're talking about these huge changes since the last glacial maximum. It's something I think people don't necessarily know if they're not focused in that research area, how much our landscape has actually changed just over the last 22,000 years and how rapid that was. So I think it's a really interesting area of time to study and consider and further understand how, as you say, lessons we might want to take on board.
Yeah, I'd say as well that it's interesting because you've got, since the last ice age, you've got about like 3 or 4 degrees of temperature rise over 10,000 years, leading to 130 meters of sea level rise. Obviously, we're going to do that in the next 100 or 200. It can't be associated with quite that much sea level rise, fingers crossed. But you're right in that the response of islands in particular to that sea level rise is something that is actually quite poorly constrained. So just the sheer amount, especially with a lot of islands that are built up of sand, the health of reefs and the way that sand moves and the way it's impacted by quite big events like cyclones is just we're only just starting to understand quite how quickly an island can appear or disappear. And we're hoping that just by understanding the formation of Murujuga in particular, that does just add some parameters to how those sand islands that you also see all the way in the Pilbara, how those might respond to that much sea level rise or in the next 100 years and meet up. The other thing that's interesting is that you've got such a beautiful human record here, and the Australian continent's interesting in that the landscape is very managed. And so we think in Murujuga there was probably traditional burning practices happening. And in the same way, basically, there is a natural landscape in Australia. The landscape doesn't exist without people that have been managing it for 65,000 years. So without, understanding how people have culturally responded and how they built the places in the Holocene, it's just it's really hard to go, what do we do in the next 100 years? And I think in a lot of places, what they're finding is just re-implementing traditional practices, re-implementing burning is such an important first step, particularly in the context of climate change, but even outside it. So we're wondering that if we can kind of, find some bits of information about how people were traditionally using it, it might be helpful to put some of those practices back into action at a policy level.
Thank you. Both very good answers to a very broad, kind of tricky question. There's a question from Nancy Boland in the chat box. He's first off said an excellent fundamental and applied science presentation. The art of seminar presentation is also excellent, and I concur with Nancy's sentiments there. It was excellent from both of you. He says, it seems there's high calcium content in the rock. And so what is the form of calcium mineral in these rocks?
So the calcium in the mafic igneous rock is in the form of pyroxenes, amphiboles and plagioclase. However, there has not been enormous work on the geology from this whole area, so that's something, as I was saying, I'll be looking more into, more specifically detailed mineralogy of each different bedrock type. And there's quite a lot of other work ongoing at the moment that's going to delve into that more, understanding I think it's Proterozoic bedrock formation. It's quite interesting. It's different to the inland Pilbara, but not an area that's had much work done on it at all, maybe because it doesn't have iron ore in it. But yeah, so pyroxene, amphiboles and plagioclase are the main three calcium-bearing minerals there. So the difference being is that we see them primarily in the gabbro, basalt and later dolerite diets, but we don't see them in the other slightly more felsic volcanic and intrusive rocks there. So.
Cool, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Sorry?
I said for the geologists out there.
There's always some good geology to include. Does anybody else have any questions at all? I was curious a little bit about, you mentioned you're keen to look into, like in your last slide, fresh water availability and how that's changed. Again, kind of thinking about a futuristic kind of, or a future world under climate variability and change. Do you think there are pockets that are, you know, might be useful freshwater resources in future as we go into a more variable climate that could help sustain life up there in the hot, dry Pilbara?
I mean, I think that's something that has been considered on a number of continents, like how there might have been certain areas of refugia for people migrating across the landscape. I think it's been touched on in some of Australia and also in the African continent. But I think importantly, those refugia that withstand sort of more dry conditions, like hotter, dry conditions, relate to groundwater resources. Whereas places like Murujuga, there are subsurface flows, but following rainfall, but it's not really the base groundwater. So these sorts of areas may well, if it was a shift to a more arid climate, that is, they may work. That's the type of area that would probably be dry. However, as we see, we've had more of an increase in cyclones and stuff like that. So in this sort of area, might continue to see more of an increase in water flows, but obviously very seasonal and reactive to certain events. But yeah, it's actually a really interesting area, but maybe more focused on groundwater systems in more inland continental settings.
Cool, thank you. And I guess from a population perspective, I mean, what sort of size population of humans are we talking about that now still rely on these sort of island areas in the area that you're looking at? Is there a large population, or is it they mainly moved on, a lot of the people?
No, so there's basically no one who lives in the islands at present. People go camp there occasionally, but not really. And before contact, like 200 years ago, it's also not very, very clear. It could have been hundreds, it could have been thousands of people aggregating in seasonal events. So we don't think people lived out there the whole time. We think that possibly people came from all across the Pilbara to feast and built these enormous shell mounds by throwing away their shells. So it could have been thousands at one point, but we really don't know very well. Probably a few hundred in any given island, right? Like,
yeah, there's you know, shell middens that are sort of meters thick, pretty much, isn't there? That just span huge amounts of space. So it's certainly at least long periods of time and enough abundance in people to build these sorts of deposits in old shellfish. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you. Question from Shirin Hickey. She said she really enjoyed the talk. It was really great to hear about your work. So interesting to hear the role of the Tufa and thinking about SLR. Thanks. It sounds like a compliment. Thanks, Shirin. If there are no other questions, Michael, are you still online? Michael Young?
Yep.
Yeah. So if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you, Michael, for introducing our speakers and helping to host this seminar series today, and to Caroline and Patrick for coming and speaking with us today about their really cool and excellent research. I can't wait to really see how it shapes up in the future. It was, yeah, it's really cool stuff. So yeah, I'm sure. And we will make this seminar available on our YouTube channel in due time as well. So I'll let you know, both of you know, since you're not in the school, when that is as well. But yes, on behalf of everyone listening, I'd say thank you very much, and thanks, Michael, as well.